Hey, civics and economics classes! All right, so this is going to be a video lecture starting our last unit in the civics part of this class. After this, we're going to move on to economics. The name of the unit, because you're taking notes and you're going to put a header on your paper, is it's Unit 4. It's called The Purpose of National, State, and Local Laws and the Legal System. Today, we're just going to cover some basics. We're going to cover the roots of American law, like documents where we, have adopted ideas, moral codes, legal codes, things like that. And then we're going to talk about various types of law. If you are interested in being a lawyer, then you get to learn about all the different types of law, and maybe you say, I always thought I wanted to do criminal law, but now that sounds like I'd rather do civil law. So we'll talk about that too. Things that are highlighted here in the PowerPoint notes, you need to definitely have and make sure you understand in your notes, okay? So highlight them there too. If you don't understand something from watching and rewatching my video lecture, then go on out to the internet and look up more. Go to YouTube, find yourself a video. You are responsible for your education. Okay. Slide 2. All right, so here's the deal. Sources of law. This is kind of basic, and I'm sure you guys know this, but what is a law? Basically, laws, we have them, allow us to live peacefully, make it possible for all people, organizations, governments to deal with one another. You know, the big purpose here, like that little picture says, order, control the chaos. So keep the peace and prevent violent acts, okay? When you're note-taking, you don't need to write all that down. You need to just get a big idea, summarize it in your own words. That's what learning is, not copying. All right, the sources of our law. So when we're going to look at some specifics, but there's moral codes in the past and there's legal codes. And when we think of moral codes, think of sort of like it says there, a code of conduct, right and wrong, what is ethical. Think about moral codes is they're different across various cultures and societies. Something that in the United States of America may be thought of as moral and right, you may go to another country and they may say that's immoral. Now, usually these things aren't part of law, but they can be codified into legal codes. So legal codes are a type of legislation that creates laws for society. Unlike a moral code, these can be enforced in a court of law, okay? And when you think of legal codes, this is where you get to stuff like versus killing someone versus murder. Murder is the legal construct, right? There's a code that defines what that is, okay? So be thinking about that as we go through these various sources of our law. This is sort of the roots, okay? Again, highlighting, you need to know, don't copy it. Do it in your own words. All right, so I'm going to go through these, and if you need to pause and get down more info, then do that. If you need to pause and go out to YouTube and try to find a video that helps explain it better than me, do that too. My feelings won't be hurt. So first one is the Code of Hammurabi. Now this is 1760 BC, so we are talking eons ago. An ancient Babylonian code. This is the key terms on this, and I have them highlighted. Reciprocal punishment. Reciprocal is sort of like, if you think in biblical terms, an eye for an eye. Okay, so for example, if you steal, you lose your hand, right? That's the type of stuff that is really reciprocal punishment. It doesn't literally always mean an eye for an eye. If you steal and you get your hand cut off, that's not literally the same thing, but it is that idea of demonstrating reciprocal punishment. So what you did to someone will somehow be done to you in as best way as you can. This is Code of Hammurabi, was really legal codes, okay? Now, something that's more moral codes and not necessarily legal codes is the 10 Commandments, and I'm guessing most of y'all are familiar with that if you've been to church at any point in your life. So the 10 Commandments, a list of moral and religious principles, biblical story, you know all that. Thou shalt not kill, steal, covet. Do you know all of your 10 Commandments? You should look them up. They're kind of interesting. A few of them are kind of dated. And there's also a few things on there that seem to be missing from the 10 Commandments, you know, things like don't abuse small children, or don't keep slaves. Those things didn't really get in the 10 Commandments. The Justinian codes, another legal basis that was codified many moons ago for the Byzantine Empire. The big bullet point on this one, the Justinian codes, this really becomes the basis for a lot of civil law in that empire, and then a lot of things will be adopted into our laws today. Civil law is basically lawsuits between people. Today we think of it as usually lawsuits dealing with money, but civil law is really Think of civil society, okay? So not a crime, but in some way you've damaged somebody's property, for example, or maybe you've wronged somebody in a way that's not necessarily part of a legal criminal code. And we're going to learn a whole lot more about civil law later. So at the basic level, that's it. Draconian laws. These were around 610 BC. I still hear this term all the time. People will talk about, oh, that country has such draconian laws. What they're referring to in this term is now kind of a catch-all for really, really outdated and incredibly harsh laws. An example of actual draconian law back in the day, you steal an apple, you get put to death. Okay. There are still countries today that have very draconian type laws, okay, where there's going to be incredibly harsh punishments for people that do stuff wrong. So that's where that one comes from. And then these three, we're getting a little more to slightly more modern history. The English Bill of Rights, you might recall some of these from American One. 1689, the English, they started this stuff sooner. The right to petition, the right to bear arms, things that we now see in our Bill of Rights. A lot of those originally were in the Bill of Rights for the English. British common law. Common law is the idea that current court cases can be judged based on the idea of precedent, and probably need to highlight precedent if you aren't yet familiar with that. Precedent is sort of like the tradition. It's the first ruling that all other rulings follow. Example on this that you're familiar with, the Brown versus Board of Education case. That set the precedent that we will not segregate children on the basis of race. Today, if you have a school that tries to do that, we don't even need to take them to court. We know that this is not legal because of the precedent set in Brown versus Board of Education, okay? And our system today, if you haven't really thought about this, you probably kind of know this intuitively, we follow what's known as common law, which means if the courts have already ruled on it, then we will go with what they say. The exception to this is if the courts decide to change precedent, and that does happen from time to time throughout history. It's called overturning precedent. The Iroquois National Constitution, this is basically the idea of like a president, having something like a president is thought to have influenced the U.S. Constitution. So there's a little bit of Native American influence, of course, once we started having colonists over here, taking some of their ideas and influencing our law. And then finally, the social contract, which this should be familiar from American history and earlier even on in this year. Social contract, many Enlightenment era philosophers sort of built on this. You might recognize these guys' names from the start of the year, but it's the idea that you as a citizen give up some of your rights and freedoms, but in exchange, the government will provide and protect. Okay, so the roads, the bridges, the schools, the national parks, the military, we get that in order, we pay taxes, we follow law, and as part of that social contract, the government does things for us. And then just a few more, the Magna Carta in 1215. This is the idea, this actually, over in England, the king had a little too much power. So the Magna Carta basically said the power of the leader derives from the people, okay? And really, this is democracy. The Magna Carta is huge in this list of roots because this is what we base things on today, right? We've talked about this with our Constitution. No politician from president on down is above the law, and they get their power from us. And if we decide we want to vote them out or take them out of power, they no longer have that power. Declaration of Independence, be familiar with. It says the statement is not law, but it does identify many human rights and principles that inform our laws today. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. You hear that all the time. Those ideas, those Enlightenment era ideas in the Declaration of Independence, they end up basically being woven into a lot of the laws we have today. And finally, the U.S. Constitution, which we learned about with the amendments and the articles and the powers and federalism and all of that. But also the Constitution, that is the law of this land. All of our laws in this country, they follow the Constitution, and we call that being constitutional. Now, as you know, the judicial system, if they say that there is a law and it does not follow the Constitution, they can declare that law unconstitutional and that law will go away. Okay. So the U.S. Constitution is huge. Okay. We don't run the country on a Bible. We don't run it on religion. We run it on the U.S. Constitution and the powers and the rights and the freedoms therein.